Hello everybody, Andrew Blake from the digitalaudiomanual.com. Today let's talk about chord pads and adaptive voicings in Cubase. Recently I had a viewer asking me about chords and some of the experiences that he was having by creating his chords and then moving them to the chord pads and having Cubase change his chords in unexpected ways. Now, even with an understanding of Cubase and the way that it works with chords, you still may not get the result you're looking for or find various surprises happening, but it's really about the expectations, because if you know what Cubase is going to do or the way that it behaves, you have a lot better chance of achieving the result you're looking for. So let's look at some examples of what Cubase does do with chords and what it presents to us with this concept of adaptive voicings. Let's start a discussion looking at the key editor. I'm just going to use a simple VST track with a piano sound on it. Click in the project to make 4 bars here, and then open it up in the key editor. We're going to start with very simple chords. If I come down to the option that says major under the 3-note chord triads and hit this triangle, this allows me to come over into the editor and draw simple 3-note chords. If I click and drag now in the editor, the notes in this chord consist of a C, an E, and then a G. And it's a C chord, and the note C is on the bottom. I'm going to draw another chord. It consists of the note F, A, and then C. When we move from a chord like this, moving over to a chord like this is not using adaptive voicings. What adaptive voicings is in Cubase is it looks for whatever common notes happen between any given 2 chords and tries to make the move as smooth as possible. In this case, first chord, which was a C chord and has a C on the bottom, when it moved over to the F chord, there was a C in this next chord, but on this F chord, the C is at the very top. If Cubase was using its adaptive voicing functionality and was drawing these chords for us, it would make sure that this C note wasn't drawn up high like this. Instead, it would take this C note and draw it down low, giving us a smooth transition between these 2 chords with whatever notes are the same, keeping those same notes, and only changing the ones that are different, and even moving those as little as possible. The advantage of this is typically in any professional musical situation. For example, let's say there's some background singers singing these notes, and they're going from the first chord to the second chord. For any singer, it is easier to start on a C note, and then in the very next chord, be able to still sing that same C note. And in these other notes, only have to make very little moves from one note to the next. Same thing if a piano player is actually playing these chords. Many times, their hand will stay in one position, and only a couple of fingers are going to move as they change one chord to the other. These are not hard, fast rules, but more than likely this is what you're going to see in real-world musical situations. Another example is if somebody takes these chords, breaks them up to put them in an orchestral situation, and they have one instrument in the orchestra playing the bottom note, and another instrument playing this middle set of notes, and on and on. It's a smoother situation. The orchestra instrument can go from one note to the next, and they're all close by, especially if it's like a string section or a horn section or any of these kind of situations. The idea that Cubase naturally creates these adaptive voicings from a musical point of view is a very good thing. Let me show you what I mean by that. Put this C note back where it was up on top. Let's add another chord into the mix here. I'm going to go over and hit the triangle. This time I'm going to write a G chord in, and then I'm going to draw one more chord in here. I'm going to go back to a C chord again. I'm going to draw it up very high. Ultimately, our chords now sound like this. If we were to manually do what Cubase automatically does, try to make this result what happens when you use adaptive voicings, there is a lot of editing now involved. First of all, I have to sit here and analyze what notes are in common between these chords. For example, as we looked at a minute ago, this note C is common, so I can move this. And on this last chord, again, the note C is common. I could move that. And then these notes could come down an octave. This note that's way up high on this chord could come down an octave. Now moving from one chord to the other, again, the notes move smoothly. This is just 4 chords trying to figure out how to make these move together. If we have 8 chords or 12 chords or a whole song, trying to manually draw in adaptive voicings becomes a very difficult and large task. Let's examine a little bit more complicated chord. I'm going to check this option that says 7th, draw the chord in. This is a C7th chord. It has the notes C, E, G, and B flat. Coming out of the editor, let's see how good Cubase is at recognizing what chord this is. I'm going to drag it up to a chord track. Cubase is going to analyze this chord, and indeed it called it a C7th. I'm going to open up the lower zone. I'm going to let Cubase put this chord onto the chord pads. So there's a button right here that says assign it from the chord track. If I click on that, it tells me it's going to overwrite all the other chords. I say, okay. Now we have that C7th chord on our chord pad. And I can click the chord pad. Let's grab this chord from the chord track and drag it down to the piano track. And it's going to draw in a chord. Let me open up this chord. We can see that the notes have moved around a little bit. Originally, I drew the notes close together, but now you can see there's this big gap in the middle, but it still has the same notes, a C, an E, a G, and a B flat. It's kind of spread out a little bit. What if I grab these notes from the chord pad, drag those onto the track? Let's see what happens. If I open it back up, so it did the same thing that the chord track does. But notice on the chord pads, we have buttons over here that say AV in two different spots. We can click on these buttons to highlight them and turn them on and off. These buttons that say AV stand for adaptive voicing. Notice if I click this first button for AV, it puts an AV up in the top of the actual chord pad. And if I click this second button, it says AV, it basically changes the color of the pad, puts a yellow border around it. And if we move over a little bit, we have these up and down arrows. Before we touch those, I'm going to drag this chord back up onto the piano track. And now I'm going to hit this up arrow that says the next voicing. And I'm going to drag that up into the piano track. And then I'm going to hit this next voicing again and drag that up into the piano track. And I'm going to continue that with a few more of these. And it keeps going quite a ways. I'm not going to drag all those up, but let's see what it drew in chord-wise. If I select all these and click on it, we can for sure see it changed the notes every time it drew the chords in. It always maintained the same notes, but the C, E, G, and B flat notes are moved all over the place, typically going higher all the time. So what we learned from that is that the chord pads are capable of moving the notes around in different order. So again, if you're expecting to see your chord look like this first one all the time, any number of things may change the order of these chords, giving you the same notes, but in a different order. And I'm going to click on the button for adaptive voicings, then hit this up arrow, and I can see that it turned the adaptive voicings right back off again. So when you manually change these up and down voicings yourself, you deactivate this adaptive voicing option. Notice next to these arrows, there's a symbol for a padlock. If I click on that padlock, all these arrows gray out, and I can no longer change those voicings. So if I want to set this pad so that it doesn't change, I have this option of clicking on this padlock. Now what we want to see is how does Cubase change from one chord to another, and how does the adaptive voicings play into that? So I'm going to click on this next pad. I'm going to change it to an F chord. I can go over here on the right, just click on an F and it'll automatically draw it in for me. Let's go to the third pad. I'm going to change that to a G. Now every time I click on a pad and write a new chord in, by default it puts that little AV up in the corner again, which means those pads are going to work with this adaptive voicing. Let's turn those off. I'm going to click on the pad, hit the button, and click on the pad for this one, hit the button. So there's no longer an AV up in the corner. Let's drag these chords up onto a track and see what it does. The F, the G. I'm going to go back and grab the C and add that onto the end. Let's open that up and see what it did. When we look at this example, every chord stayed exactly like it originally was. The main note on the bottom, in this case a C, F, and a G, and the main notes of the chord up on top. And they didn't change any kind of order, and you can see that these chords kind of jump around. When you look at these three notes as compared to these three notes, definitely aren't going straight across in any way. They're making big jumps up and down. Let's go back, and for each pad, let's turn the adaptive voicing feature back on. Just click the pad, hit adaptive voicing. Now I'm going to drag these chords up onto the track, and then open these back up. And the difference now, if you look at the one on the end, it took the two notes that were common, kept those together. None of these notes are making any large jumps. They're only moving a little bit from each chord to the next. So definitely the adaptive voicing feature took over in terms of how these notes were written into this key editor. Which brings us to this last button, which also says adaptive voicing. But this one says the adaptive voicing reference. And what this is telling us, if we turn this on and it puts a yellow border around whichever pad we've selected, it's going to use this pad to kind of base the adaptive voicings of all the other pads. In other words, they're going to look at the way this first one is and try to keep their notes in some relative way that corresponds back to the first pad. Let's drag these up and see what it does. And when I open that back up, we can see that everything kind of references this first group of chords, and all the other chords are very close in the way they look. In fact, if you don't look close enough, some of them look like they're almost identical, but rather one or two notes are moved. So they are referencing the very first chord. So there's one more thing I want to share with you today that I think is kind of important. And the reason I think it's important is because I remember a time where I was quite confused by this. So I want to spare you that frustration if I can. On every MIDI and audio track in Cubase, you go over to the chord tab and open that up. The very first drop-down list gives you the options to map notes to the chord track. You hit this drop-down list, you get all kinds of options here. If I take these chords from the chord track and drag them back to the VST instrument track, Cubase creates a series of chords on the track, which is a great feature in itself. If I select all these chords and open it up, all these notes and chords open up in the key editor, and I can take any one of these notes and I can begin doing editing any way I want. I can move the notes around, move them up or down. I have complete freedom to do that, change my notes any way I need to. And the reason I can do that, I go back to the track and look over at that drop down. It's because it's set to off. And when it's set to off, I have complete freedom to edit these notes any way I want. There are other functions you're going to perform in Cubase that are going to change that behavior. For example, if I go up to the project menu, come down to the option that says chord track. If I look in the sub menu, I have an option here that says chords to MIDI. If I take that option, Cubase does the same thing I did a second ago and drags these chords onto the VST track. And again, if I double click on this and open it up, I now have a series of notes in the key editor. But this is where you're going to get a surprise if you don't know what's going on. If I click on any note in this scenario, I can still hear it. But if I try to move it, the minute I let go of it with my mouse, it goes right back to where it was. And this operation in itself can be very surprising, quite a bit frustrating. You're in the middle of trying to edit a project, and you find that none of your notes can be changed. You try to drag them around. If you move them from side to side, they may jump onto other notes. You definitely no longer have complete freedom as it is to just move things around. What's causing this to happen? If we come out of this key editor and look at the track now, over in this little drop-down area, it's no longer set to off. Cubase has automatically changed the setting and selected the option that says Voicings. Without going into long detail on that, the idea behind this is when this is set to voicings or some of these other choices, Cubase is going to do some work in the background and analyze the notes on our VST instrument, and it's going to make sure that it conforms to the chord track. If I go up to the chord track, I can actually start changing chords, and then Cubase is automatically going to change these notes on this VST track without me doing anything. In essence, it's continually monitoring the notes on this track, making sure that it always conforms to the chord track. Once again, if you're working with chords, this could be a surprising behavior. It can make you wonder why your notes are changing in ways that you may not expect. So the concept you want to understand there is if you want complete control over your notes for your own editing, you always want to make sure that this option over here on the left is set to off. On the other hand, there's times where you're going to want to have this set to voicings or other things, but when you do that, you're going to want to know why you're doing it and what result you're trying to achieve. So take those tips and experiment with the chords on your chord pads and in your chord track and your options for adaptive voicings. Go make some great music, and I'll see you next time. All right, it's going to wrap it up for today. As always, if you haven't already, click the link in the description of this video to learn how you can get access to the all-new Digital Audio Manual Preferred. It's the clear, step-by-step solution showing you not only the tips, but all the secret and typically never talked about features that'll take you to a higher level of using your software. If you've been searching for an all-in-one solution to take you from start to finish and learning Cubase and Wavelab and other music software, this is exactly what you've been looking for. So click on the link in the description and come and be part of the clear path to a better learning experience. So today we had a discussion about customizing adaptive voicings. We began by discussing what they are and how Cubase actually uses adaptive voicings. We looked at how to turn them on and off with the chord pads, and we saw different scenarios that could bring us unpredictable results if we don't know how Cubase is actually handling the chords. And then we cleared those up with some examples, and we'll continue to look at all our different creative options and the tools that we have available to us. As always, it's great to have you guys here, and I'll see you on the next video.